Look at these two graphs. One of them is an existential threat to the United States, while the other is the greatest source of American wealth. Most of the media is being focused on trade deficit. But what if I told you that everything you know about trade deficit is most likely wrong? Everything that the media is telling you about trade deficit could not be farther from reality. Because trade deficit is what makes the United States so enormously rich. And fixing this problem is only making the United States poorer. But to understand that, you have to understand how global trade works. When you're trading inside a country such as China, you can use the local currency. If you're in Brazil, you can use the local currency. If you're in the US, you will use the US dollars. But when the two countries trade with one another, they do not recognize the currencies of one another, because outside the borders of that country, that currency is meaningless. Take the Brazilian currency. I don't know what currency they have, but nobody would want the Brazilian currency outside Brazil. So when Brazil trades with China, the Middle East, or the rest of the world, other countries will demand from Brazil something in return, something valuable, such as goods or services. If that's how international trade works, then why is China selling so much to the United States and in exchange China receiving so much dollars? They're not demanding something real from the United States, such as American cars, American technology, American services. Why is China ready to accept trillions of dollars without actually getting real value in return? That does not make sense according to what you have just explained how international trade works. To understand that, you have to understand what is the trust level between other countries. And America holds a very unique position in the world. If China wants to trade with Brazil, for example, they are going to demand goods and services from one another. But what if China wants to sell something to Brazil, or Brazil wants something from China, but Brazil has nothing to offer to China? How these two countries are going to trade between themselves? It makes no sense. They're not going to trade between themselves because Brazil does not have something that China has. But in order to make this transaction possible, we have created the US dollar. And that's the value that the dollar gets it into the picture. Since the dollar is the global reserve currency, China does not necessarily have to get real goods and services from Brazil. As long as Brazil can give China the US dollars, China is ready to give them the goods and the services. Because the dollar plays the function of the reserve currency. China can take those dollars and exchange them for oil and gas from Middle East. Middle Eastern countries would gladly accept the dollars because they know that using these dollars, they can buy other things from all across the globe. But that's not the status that every currency enjoys around the globe. So that is the value that the dollar provides for the rest of the world. And that's why other countries will gladly sell to the United States real goods, real cars, agricultural products, steel, and a long list of other products to the United States in exchange for green pieces of papers, because they can take those pieces of papers and exchange them for other goods, which makes the United States' main export the US dollar. It's not the American cause, it's not the American technology, it's not the American place, but the US dollars, because US dollars can be used internationally. And that's the leverage that the United States has against the rest of the world. Other countries, such as China, have to produce EVs. They have to invest in making steel so cheap so that they beat the competition across the globe. But the US does not have to do that because other countries are gladly selling their cheap steel to the United States for exchange the US dollars. And how much does it take the United States to print those dollars? Absolutely nothing. Yesterday there were pieces of papers, but today they are simply digits in the computers. So if you want to have the global reserve currency, then you must run a deficit. If you're not running a deficit and your currency is a reserve currency, now a reserve currency means that other countries, instead of using their own currencies, they use your currency to trade between themselves, since one country doesn't have what the other has, so they still want to trade between themselves. And if you're going to fix the trade deficit, then there is going to be a limited supply of the dollars in the market, and these two countries will no longer be able to trade between themselves. What is going to happen? They will stop using the dollar, and the dollar, first of all, will stop being the global reserve currency. So running a trade deficit is a great advantage for the United States. Secondly, it provides the United States with the global dominance on the banking. If two countries want to transfer US dollars between one another, usually they will use an intermediary bank, and that intermediary bank is the United States Bank, because the dollar is a US currency and United States has a complete control over it, which is why if you look at the entire global financial system, every country that uses the dollar has US banks within themselves. But why can't China simply buy from the United States as much as the United States is buying from China? China buys from the United States around $500 billion, while China buys from the United States around $100 billion. And China is a very rich country. Why can't simply they just buy from the United States as much and we have solved the problem? First of all, China is not as rich as a lot of people think. The average Chinese is much poorer than the average American. The GDP per capita in the US is around $90,000, while the GDP per capita in China is around $12,000 to $13,000. But since there are far more people in China, the Chinese economy is so huge and so large. But if you look at the details, the average Chinese is much poorer than the average American. So even if they wanted so, they cannot buy as much from the United States as Americans are buying. Secondly, China does not have the global reserve currency. China would like its currency to be the reserve currency, and China does not have to produce cheap steel, cheap electrical cars to sell them to the rest of the world. And the rest of the world will simply sell their goods and services to China for Chinese yuan. But because they don't have that status, they have to work hard to compensate for that. While the United States has the global reserve currency, which allows it to get those stuff at a fraction of the price that China is doing. In fact, it allows the United States to get those goods for almost free and exchange some digits in the computers. If China does not have that advantage, it's not their fault. It's the United States that must be grateful for the advantage of the reserve currency and not blame China for not having the reserve currency. Thirdly, why are we so mad that China is trying to get rich? Yes, China is actually producing those goods at a fraction of the price, and they're trying to beat the competition. They're trying to produce electrical cars at a fraction of the price that Tesla is doing. They're trying to massively invest in steel so that they can actually produce that steel at a fraction of the price. So American car companies can buy that steel and lower down their prices further. Is it really bad that another country is trying to get rich? Is it really bad that another country, while not having the advantages of the United States, is still working hard to build something and bring value and add value to the global economy? Is that really that bad? Yes, they're making real progress, but they deserve it. They are working hard for that. They are not kind of enjoying it. They're not consuming so much. It's America who's consuming so much. China is building so much, and we have to be very grateful that there's so many people working so hard producing those stuff. The question you should be asking yourself is that, what will China do with so many dollars if they buy so much goods from America? China is selling so much in the United States, and as a result of that, they have accumulated hundreds of billions, in some cases trillions of dollars of American US dollars. Either they're taking those dollars and trading with the rest of the world. For example, they're buying so much oil from Middle East. And in what currency does Chinese pay the Middle Eastern countries for that oil? The US dollar. They're paying Brazil in US dollar. They're paying other Asian countries with the US dollars. And that is a great thing for America, because American dollars are being used in global trade, which strengthen the position of the United States as the global reserve currency. Secondly, they're investing that money back into the United States. One of the ways is by buying American government bonds. If you literally just pull out top 10 buyers of American debt, and you will instantly see that China holds around $800 billion of American debt or American government bonds. Now, I want to ask you a question. Where do you think they got the dollars to buy those American bonds in the first place? Obviously, they simply built real good products. They brought them to the United States. They sold them in America. They got those dollars and invested it back in America. Is that a bad thing for America? Secondly, they take these dollars and they invest in the stock market in the United States. And that's why a lot of stocks are being owned by Chinese. So imagine there is an American startup raising money, and they want to raise money to build a technology in the United States, to build an AI company, to build a manufacturing plant in the United States. And they will raise money. And there is a Chinese company that just sold in America, made a lot of money in America, and is being invested in America. Is that a bad thing for America? Think about that for a moment. But those trillions of dollars of investments being made by China in the United States will not be illustrated in the trade surplus. There will still be a trade deficit, even though that most of that money is still being invested back into the United States, in the US stock market. And that's part of the reason why the US financial markets are the largest markets in the world. The US stock market is the largest market in the world because everybody is investing in the US stock market, and that benefits both Americans, the American economy. Now, the question is that what happens if we fix this problem with tariffs? Let's say hypothetically that we are going to impose the tariffs and we are going to fix the trade balance between the two countries, between the United States and the rest of the world, including China. What will be the final outcome? Will that be beneficial for the United States? First of all, Americans will no longer enjoy cheap goods from China. China, for example, can produce something at a much cheaper price than the United States. Let's say this pen. Let's say this pen costs in China around $10, and we're going to impose a 50% tariff on it. If you bring this pen from China into the United States, the final price will not be $10 as it's supposed to be. It is going to be $15 since there is a 50% tariff. Now, that extra 50% that you are going to pay at the end of the day is not going to go back to the Chinese manufacturer, but rather it is going to go to the US government. So a 50% tariff is simply going to make foreign products in the United States much more expensive. It's a form of tax, if you want to call it like that. It's not hurting China, but it's hurting the American consumers. It's raising prices in the United States. But some people might say, well, now China is selling less in the United States. Is that a good thing? Let's ask ourselves. China is selling less in the United States, which means that now less dollars will be sent to China. China has a huge deficit from now onwards of dollars, but China still have to trade with the rest of the world. China has to buy oil from Middle Eastern countries. They have to buy goods and services or technology from the European countries. China has to buy minerals from Africa and maybe agricultural products from Latin America. But now it does not have dollars because United States does not want to run a trade deficit, but they still have to trade. So China is going to go to Middle East and say to the Middle Eastern leaders, listen guys, United States dollar no longer wants to provide us with dollars, so we have to trade one way or another. So let's bypass the dollar because there is a deficit of dollars in the market. It's not my fault, it's not your fault, it's America's fault. So China will start buying the Middle Eastern oil either with Chinese yuan or any other currency. And then China will go to European countries and will say, listen, European countries, you guys wanted the US dollars, but America no longer wants to run a trade deficit, so we have to choose an alternative currency. Let's either choose the European euro or the Chinese yuan. And over time, the rest of the world will start using the US dollar less, and they will start using alternative currencies more and more, and maybe not in a single day or overnight, but over a long period of time, the US dollar will stop being the global reserve currency. Do you see what kind of danger does it poses to the United States? Thirdly, China has less dollars means less investments in the United States. Right now, China is selling so much in the United States and earning hundreds of billions of dollars annually. They take these hundreds of billions of dollars and invest it either in the US bond market or the United States stock market, or maybe the US real estate market. So more money being spent in the United States, and the more money being spent, the faster the GDP growth. Now, the entire point of the GDP growth is the more money spent in the economy, the faster or the bigger the GDP grows. That's kind of the simplified version of how GDP works. Now, less money being spent by the Chinese, slower economic growth in the United States. Is that a good thing? You tell me. Despite both of them are deficits, the real problem is the budget deficit. And a budget deficit is very different from the trade deficit. A budget deficit is the government of the United States overspending more than it's earning. And that is a basic logic to understand why it's a problem. If you are making $50,000 and you're spending $70,000, where do you get that money from? You're getting it somewhere since you're spending that money. Most likely, it's debt. You cannot artificially create money out of nowhere. And over time, as you accumulate more debt, you get into a problem. So if you spend more than you earn, you're accumulating a lot of debt. And any kind of debt comes with some kind of interest, even if it's 1% interest rate. If you have borrowed $100,000 and you have to pay 1% interest rate, then it's an extra $1,000 a year. If you've accumulated $1 million in debt, then it's $10,000. But if that interest rate goes higher and higher, your interest debt payments start to rise as well. And that's what's happening with the US debt right now. It's snowballing over time. Once you reach in a position where you have so much debt and your interest payments are so much, what do you think the government is doing? The government is collecting money from taxes. Now, instead of taking those taxes and spending it to make America great by building roads, infrastructure, better schools, better everything, you cannot do that because you have accumulated so much deficit, and now all of those taxes is going to go into paying the interest on the debt. Just like if you have accumulated so much debt, you get your paycheck at the end of the month, and instead of paying rent, instead of getting a better house, or instead of getting better food, you are going to make interest payments on your credit cards. It's the exact same logic. It's no different from that. But at some point, you might have to default if you don't have the money. If your income is not growing as much as your debt, then you have to default. Now, an average person is going to default, but the government of the United States will not default because the US government borrows money in its own currency. Imagine you are going to borrow money in the currency that you have a printing machine in your house and you can print it. Will you ever default? Well, absolutely not. And that's why the United States government, no matter how much money it borrows, it cannot possibly default. What is going to happen in the worst case scenario? When you have accumulated so much debt and you have to pay your lenders, you are going to create money out of nothing. You're going to print more money. So the Federal Reserve is going to step in and say, oh, the government is not making enough from taxes to pay the lenders. So the Fed creates the money and you pay the public lenders or the interest on the public lenders. Now, this is where the real problem actually starts. When more amount of money in the economy chases the exact same amount of goods, that's what we call inflation. So this path essentially forces the government to print more money, create more inflation, which devalues the real value of your money. And that's where the real problem, where the deficit is. Because higher inflation means that the purchasing power of your income goes down. So if you're making $50,000 and you could buy a certain amount of goods, now you can buy less goods with the $50,000. If you have saved up $80,000 in the bank account, now those $80,000 can buy less things. Essentially, you are becoming poorer every time that the government is printing money. But higher inflation forces the Federal Reserve to increase the interest rates because we want to control inflation. And higher interest rate also makes you poor. If you want to go and buy a house, you're probably going to get a mortgage. And it doesn't matter whether that house costs $500,000 or $550,000 or $600,000. The final price of that house will be determined by what kind of interest rate or a mortgage rate you are going to get, because you will get a mortgage. And 1% interest rate in your mortgage rate will make a huge difference in the final price of the house. The life of the average American is filled with debt. If you want to buy a car, 80% of all the new cars are being financed with an auto loan. So the interest rate on your auto loan will determine the final price of the car. Your credit card, a personal loan, and all sorts of loans that people actually get, which means that what the government is doing right now is essentially going to lead to higher inflation, which will lead to higher interest rate, which will lead to making you poorer. So despite what you hear in the media about the trade deficit, this is not a problem. The real problem is the budget deficit that is not being solved at all. Which is why you probably should think about yourself. You probably should think that the government is not going to take the right decision and the situation is going to deteriorate much farther. The only way that you can protect yourself is by start investing, by understanding how the financial market works, by have the right tools in your hands, by understanding how the system works and how generational wealth is being made through the stock market. That is probably the best shot that you actually have. Because I bet that most of the people right now who are in their late 20s and 30s most likely will not be receiving Social Security, because Social Security will have to cut their spending substantially by the year 2034. And if this trend continues with the deficit, then I don't think anybody is going to receive any kind of Social Security in 20 or 25 years from now. So the best shot that you have is to start thinking of yourself, is to start investing, have the right tools, which is exactly what we do in our academy. We give you the tools, we give you the knowledge, and we give you the systems so that you don't have to follow anybody, but you can use those tools and strategies to build an investing strategy that fits your needs and your goals. Check it out in the link in the description. Thanks for watching, and I will see you in the next one.